All right, welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're tackling something I think you'll find particularly fascinating, especially given your interest in really getting to the bottom of things quickly and efficiently. We're talking about self-directed learning, or SDL, and how it works within the framework of problem-based learning, PBL.
Yeah, and we'll be drawing on that research article you sent over to unpack how these two approaches, SDL and PBL, relate to each other, where they overlap, and where their differences lie. It's all about evidence-based insights today, straight from the source.
Perfect. So let's kick things off with PBL. Your article really dives into its origins in medical education, specifically at McMaster University in Canada way back in the 60s. It seems like the catalyst there was this feeling that, traditional medical education wasn't quite cutting it.
Yeah, there was this sense that first-year med students were having a tough time bridging the gap between those basic science courses and the realities of patient care.
Right, like how does anatomy actually translate to diagnosing and treating a real person,
Yeah. Exactly. And they also found it difficult to see the connections between different medical specialties. It was all very compartmentalized.
So PBL came along and kind of shook things up.
Yeah.
Your article contrasts this with how fields like law and business were using real-world problems in their teaching. They typically brought those in after students had a solid foundational knowledge base.
Right. But McMaster's big innovation was to flip that script. They threw those realistic medical problems into the mix right from the get-go, making those problems the central driver of learning.
Before students had even acquired a ton of background knowledge.
Yeah, exactly, which is pretty different.
So in a typical PBL setup, you've got these small groups of students, and they're presented with these really authentic, complex medical scenarios. What happens next?
Well, they'll start by discussing the problem, trying to make sense of it with what they already know, right? This usually happens in what they call tutorial meetings, with a tutor to guide the process.
So it's a collaborative effort to unpack this complex problem.
Absolutely. And as they wrestle with it, they inevitably bump into what they don't know, the gaps in their understanding. And these then become what's called learning issues. Basically, they're turning those unknowns into the questions they need to answer.
Ah, I see. So these learning issues are essentially student-generated, driven by the problem itself.
Right. And this is where that self-directed study phase kicks in. Students go off either individually or maybe in smaller groups to dig into those learning issues, find relevant information, and fill those knowledge gaps they've identified.
So they're essentially crafting their own learning path, deciding where to go next, what to focus on.
Precisely. And then after this period of self-study, they come back together for another tutorial to share their findings, critically evaluate the information as a group, and continue that discussion.
I'm assuming the tutor plays a pretty active role throughout this whole process.
Oh, definitely. The tutor is there to facilitate the discussion, make sure it's productive, offer support and guidance when needed, and kind of keep track of the group's progress.
Okay, so big picture. What's PBL ultimately aiming for? What are its goals?
Well, PBL sets its sights pretty high, I'd say. It wants students to come away with a flexible, adaptable knowledge base, strong collaboration skills, sharp problem-solving abilities, and a real intrinsic motivation to keep learning.
And of course, the skill we're really zeroing in on today, self-directed learning.
Exactly. How PBL fosters SDL is really the heart of our deep dive today.
Which brings us to SDL. Your article does a great job of tracing this concept back to its philosophical roots, all the way to existentialism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility for one's own learning journey.
Yeah, it's interesting how this philosophical foundation then translates into a concrete definition. Knowles, back in '75, defined SDL as individuals taking the initiative, taking ownership of their learning. And that means everything from figuring out what they need to learn and setting goals to finding resources, choosing strategies, and evaluating whether they've actually achieved those goals.
And all of this can happen either with or without the direct guidance of an instructor.
Right.
Now, it's important to note that, as Knowles pointed out, SDL isn't necessarily this solo endeavor, right? It exists on a spectrum, from highly teacher-directed learning on one end to very learner-driven approaches on the other.
Exactly. And as you move toward that self-directed end of this spectrum, learners gain increasing control over various aspects of their learning.
Like determining what they need to know, how they're going to approach it, and so on.
Exactly.
So how does this idea of SDL actually play out within the specific context of PBL? I mean, what does self-directed learning actually look like in a PBL environment?
Well, your article cites Schmidt, who defines SDL and PBL as the student's readiness to engage in learning activities that they themselves define, rather than activities dictated by a teacher or curriculum.
So it's about students taking ownership of shaping their own learning process.
Exactly. And this involves both the willingness and the actual ability to take on that self-directed role.
Okay, so it's not just about wanting to be in charge of your learning. You also need to have the skills and strategies to actually do it effectively.
Right. And to break down SDL even further, the article brings in Candy's 4 dimensions of SDL from his 1991 work.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first one is personal autonomy.
Which is essentially that feeling of independence and freedom to make choices about your learning.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Then there's self-management in learning. This is that ability to organize and manage your own learning activities. So like planning your study time, selecting resources, tracking your progress, that sort of thing.
Okay, makes sense. What's the third dimension?
The independent pursuit of learning, which involves taking the initiative to seek knowledge beyond what's formally presented in a course or program.
So going beyond the assigned readings or lectures, doing that extra digging.
Exactly. And finally, there's learner control of instruction, where learners have a say in how they're being taught, the methods used, the pace, the content, that kind of thing.
So it's about having a voice in shaping the actual learning experience.
Exactly.
Now, how do these 4 dimensions actually manifest within the PBL process?
Well, think about it. When students analyze a problem in a tutorial, they're using that personal autonomy to decide what they need to learn. Then, based on their existing knowledge and understanding, they exercise self-management by determining how deeply they need to dive into a particular topic. They're independently choosing resources, critically evaluating them, planning their study time, and even assessing their own learning after each tutorial.
Right, so they're constantly making decisions about their learning path, guided by their own questions and goals. And this brings up something interesting. The article argues that this level of freedom and control in PBL tends to promote what's called deep-level processing.
Yeah, that's where learners are really striving to grasp the meaning behind the information, connect it to what they already know, and understand the why behind the what.
As opposed to just surface learning, where you're basically just memorizing facts without really internalizing them.
Exactly, and I think that makes sense. When you're invested in finding answers to your own questions, you're more likely to engage with the material in a deeper way.
Definitely. Now, your article also references Mello and Lin, who back in 2000 outlined several key PBL features that they argued are crucial for fostering SDL. Do you want to touch on those?
Sure. So they pointed to the student-centered approach inherent in PPL, the fact that it starts with a problem, the process of identifying knowledge gaps and then turning those into learning issues, the emphasis on individual study time, the focus on critically evaluating resources, the opportunity to apply new knowledge back to the problem, and then the encouragement of reflection on their SDL skills.
Wow, that's a lot. It seems like PBL really weaves SDL into its very fabric.
It does, and I think that independent literature search component is particularly powerful. It's not just about finding information, it's about developing those essential information-seeking skills that are going to serve learners well throughout their lives.
Absolutely. And another interesting aspect here is that SDL within PBL is iterative. If, after their initial round of study, a student realizes they still don't quite get it, they can go back, refine their learning issues, and then go through that whole process of searching, evaluating, and integrating information all over again.
Right. It's a constant cycle of learning and refining your understanding.
Which naturally brings us to lifelong learning. The article makes this connection between SDL and lifelong learning, suggesting that SDL is both essential for lifelong learning and that it also gets strengthened through lifelong learning.
Yeah, they're very much interconnected, and Candy even viewed SDL as the core activity in pursuing learning independently throughout life. It's about equipping individuals to continue learning long after they've finished formal schooling. That capacity for self-education.
Powerful stuff. But I do want to make sure we clarify something important here. SDL and PBL isn't about just throwing students into the deep end and saying, okay, go learn, good luck.
Oh, absolutely not. It's not this isolated, unguided, sink or swim situation.
Right. Students are collaborating in groups, they're often identifying shared learning needs, and they've got tutors providing that scaffolding and support. It's not about lack of support or just self-teaching, as the article points out.
Yeah, those are some common misconceptions about SDL and PBL. It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay, good. So we've explored SDL within the world of PBL. Now let's bring in another important concept, self-regulated learning, or SRL.
Right.
Your article describes SRL as this kind of umbrella term that encompasses a range of processes, things like goal setting, metacognition, and self-assessment. Basically, how learners actively control their own cognition and motivation to achieve those learning goals.
Right. And it rests on some key assumptions, like the idea that learners are actively engaged in their own learning. They use standards and goals to guide themselves. Their behavior is purposeful and directed towards those goals, and that SRL actually makes a difference in how well they learn.
So it's about learners being in the driver's seat, making intentional choices, and taking responsibility for their own learning.
Exactly. The SRL process, as often associated with Win and Hadwin, typically involves several phases: planning, breaking down the task, setting clear learning goals, developing strategies to reach those goals, monitoring their progress as they go, and reflecting on their learning process.
And your article highlights several key ingredients of SRL. Let's see, there's metacognition, that awareness and understanding of your own thinking and learning process.
Yep. Then there's that intrinsic motivation we talked about earlier, that internal drive to learn.
And of course, all those affective factors, a learner's emotions, attitudes, beliefs about learning, all of that plays a role.
Right. And then, of course, there's that strategic action piece where learners are actively employing different learning strategies within a specific learning context.
And speaking of context, your article points out how both individual learner characteristics and the learning environment itself can influence SRL.
Oh, definitely. Things like the learner's goals, interests, prior knowledge, all of that comes into play. And on the environment side, things like the clarity of instructions, the structure provided, the level of control learners feel they have, and even the qualities of the teacher can all affect how well students are able to self-regulate.
So it's a complex interplay of internal and external factors. Now, when we compare SDL and SRL, it seems like there's a lot of overlap.
Oh, for sure. Both emphasize active engagement in learning, goal-directed behavior, setting goals, analyzing tasks, planning, implementing those plans, self-evaluation, and using those metacognitive skills, and both acknowledge the importance of intrinsic motivation.
So they're definitely kindred spirits, but they're not identical twins. The article does highlight some key distinctions.
Right. So one key difference is that SDL is viewed as both a characteristic of how learning environments are designed and a characteristic of the learner, while SRL is seen primarily as a learner characteristic.
Okay, I see. So SDL is kind of embedded in the design of things like PBL, while SRL is more about what's going on within the individual learner.
Yeah, exactly. And another distinction has to do with their historical origins. SDL really emerged from the world of adult education with a focus on learning that takes place outside of formal schooling.
Like that independent pursuit of learning dimension we talked about earlier.
Exactly. SRL, on the other hand, has been more commonly studied within traditional school settings.
So they come from slightly different worlds, and this leads to another point your article makes about SDL as a design principle. It tends to place a stronger emphasis on the learner's freedom to choose and evaluate their own learning resources, maybe even more so than what you'd typically see in SRL contexts within a more conventional classroom.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think this ties into the most important distinction, which has to do with the level of learner control, especially at the very beginning of the learning process when the learning task is being defined. In SDL, even in a collaborative PBL setting, the learner is essentially involved in determining what needs to be learned. But in SRL, the learning task might be set by the teacher.
Ah, so someone practicing SDL in a PBL environment is likely using self-regulation skills. But someone self-regulating their learning for a teacher-assigned task might not necessarily be demonstrating self-direction in that broader sense.
Exactly. The article concludes that SDL can encompass SRL, but SRL doesn't necessarily encompass SDL. SDL is often playing a more foundational role at the outset of learning.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've laid out the theoretical groundwork. Now let's dive into the research and see what it tells us about SDL and SRL in action, specifically within PBL.
Sounds good.
Your article notes that most of the studies in this area have focused on medical education, which isn't surprising given PBL's roots, and a lot of them have zeroed in on SDL.
Right. Bloomberg's review from 2000 is a major touchstone here. It looked at whether PBL students actually become self-directed learners, what learning strategies they use, and what their learning outcomes are like.
And what were the key takeaways?
Well, the review suggested that PBL does seem to foster SDL, with both students and faculty generally agreeing on that. It also found that PBL students tend to use library resources more frequently and critically, and they report using deeper level learning strategies more often. However, Bloomberg emphasized that more research was needed to really dig into the specifics of how, when, and why PBL promotes SDL. It's not a simple equation.
Okay, so more to be explored. And it looks like several studies have built on Bloomberg's work, examining different facets of SDL and PBL. For instance, Vanden Herk and colleagues found, back in '99, that senior PBL students were more likely to investigate topics beyond the initial learning issues that were identified, they reported spending more time studying, and they performed better academically.
Right, which suggests that developing SDL and PBL isn't this immediate transformation. It's a process of growth that unfolds over time as students gain experience.
Makes sense. Now, what about that crucial step of generating learning issues? I'm curious about research in that area.
Well, Verkooijen and colleagues tackled that in 2006. They found that when students were given that initial autonomy to generate their own learning issues, they ended up using a wider range of resources, they put in more study time, and they had deeper, richer discussions about their findings.
So that act of defining their own learning needs seems to be a real catalyst for engagement and self-direction.
Yeah, I think so. Now, time management and self-monitoring are also key aspects of SDL. And Vanden Herk's 2006 study, though she actually used the term SRL, found that while not all students actively planned their time or monitored their learning, those who did reported using their study time more efficiently, and self-monitoring was linked to better academic performance.
Interesting. So even though PBL encourages SDL, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that all students will fully embrace those self-regulatory practices.
Right, it's not automatic.
Okay. Now, your article mentioned some interesting research by Dolmans and Schmidt that looked at what influences students' choices about what to learn. What do they find?
Well, their studies in 94 and 2000 showed that first-year students tend to rely more heavily on those provided materials, like textbooks and lecture notes. But as they get further along in the program, those senior PBL students are more guided by the discussions that happen within their tutorial groups.
So as they gain experience with PBL, they seem to become more comfortable with shaping their own learning path based on those peer interactions and the insights that emerge from those discussions.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not just about what happens during the program. There's also research that's looked at PBL graduates. For instance, Shin and colleagues found in '93 that medical graduates from PBL programs were better at staying up to date on clinical practices after graduation compared to those from traditional programs. And in 2006, Schmidt and his team found that PBL grads rated their own SDL skills much higher than grads from conventional programs.
So it seems like the impact of PBL on SDL extends beyond the classroom.
It does. And some studies have directly investigated whether PBL truly fosters SDL. For example, Mello and Lin's 2000 study found that PBL students generated more learning issues that were connected to the underlying hypotheses of the problem. They used a wider range of resources, and they were better at putting all that information together. Even Sonnet also did some interesting case studies in 2000 that showed SDL development in first semester medical students in a PBL curriculum. So it seems like that process can start early on.
That's encouraging, but it sounds like the research isn't all rosy. Your article mentions some studies with less clear-cut findings.
Right. There are some mixed results, which isn't all that surprising when you're dealing with something as complex as human learning. For example, Lloyd Jones and Hawk, in their 2004 case studies, reported that some first-year students felt unsure about what they should be focusing on, relying more on their peers and faculty for guidance rather than independently selecting their learning resources.
Okay, so that initial uncertainty is understandable, especially when you're transitioning into a new learning environment that emphasizes self-direction. What about other studies?
Well, Kivela and Kivila's 2005 study in Hong Kong found that even though students became less reliant on lectures after PBL was introduced, they still tended to look for teacher approval.
So even with that increased independence, there's still a desire for external validation, which suggests that maybe that transition to true self-direction isn't always a clean break from those more traditional patterns.
Right, exactly. And the article also highlights the importance of considering students' own perceptions of SDL in PBL. Dahlgren and Dahlgren's interviews back in 2002 revealed that while some students found that freedom of SDL challenging or felt uncertain about where to direct their efforts, more senior students tended to express greater confidence in their ability to guide their own learning.
Which again points to that developmental aspect, that self-directed learning skills tend to grow with experience.
Yeah. And in 2005, Dornan and colleagues found that while students recognized the importance of SDL for their future clinical work, they also felt they needed ongoing support from their teachers to really make it work. And then there's Srinivasan's 2007 study, where some students specifically preferred PBL because it encouraged them to take charge of their learning. So it seems like there's a real variety in how students experience and perceive SDL.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And your article also mentions that the dynamics within those PBL groups can also play a role.
Oh, definitely. Lohman and Finkelstein's 2000 study suggested that smaller and medium-sized PBL groups were associated with higher levels of SDL readiness compared to those larger groups.
Interesting. So that group size might be an important factor to consider when implementing PBL.
Yeah. Now, to round things out, let's touch on a few studies that specifically investigated SRL within PBL. There aren't as many of these, but they offer some valuable insights.
Okay, let's hear them.
So in 2001, Evenson and his team conducted a qualitative study exploring how students self-regulated their learning in a PBL program, and they noted the evolution of students' learning strategies, or stances as they called them, and how students developed a stronger sense of professional identity through the program.
So PBL seems to support not just the development of SRL skills, but also a sense of self within that professional context.
Yeah, I think so. Then there's Sungur and Takaya's 2006 study. They found that PBL students reported higher levels of intrinsic motivation, they valued the tasks more, they engaged in more elaboration and critical thinking, and they used more metacognitive strategies.
That aligns well with what we know about the goals of PBL.
Definitely. And finally, there's Langendijk's 2006 research on self-assessment accuracy. It showed that high-achieving PBL students were more critical of their own work.
So they were more aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, more attuned to areas where they could improve.
Exactly. So those are just a few examples of research specifically focused on SRL and PBL.
Great. So it sounds like there's a decent body of evidence supporting the idea that PBL can foster both SDL and SRL, but there are also some nuances and complexities to consider.
Right. The research paints a multifaceted picture, as it often does with these educational approaches.
All right, so let's bring it all home. What are the key takeaways from your article's analysis of SDL and PBL and its relationship to SRL?
Well, first off, it's important to remember that while SDL and SRL have a lot in common, like active engagement, goal-directed behavior, metacognition, and motivation, they're not exactly interchangeable terms. SDL casts a wider net, encompassing both the design of the learning environment and the learner's own characteristics, with a strong emphasis on that initial control over defining the learning task.
Okay, so SDL is more about setting the stage, and SRL is about how the learner performs on that stage.
That's a good way to put it. Now, the article draws three main conclusions based on its review of the research. First, both SDL and SRL are developmental processes. They unfold and mature over time as students gain experience in PBL. We see that in studies showing how senior students exhibit greater self-direction, and even in research suggesting SDL development within the first semester of a PBL program. This points to the idea that these skills can be learned and honed, but it takes time, and it often involves navigating a period of uncertainty as students adapt to this more autonomous approach.
Right. It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. The second conclusion is that the self aspect in these processes is absolutely vital. The research highlights the importance of students generating their own learning issues, monitoring their own progress, reflecting on their learning, and accurately assessing their own understanding. Those self-driven elements are essential for SDL and SRL to really take root.
It's not just about being presented with a problem. It's about taking ownership of the learning process.
Exactly. And the third conclusion is that the research on whether PBL actually fosters SDL or SRL offers a mixed bag. While many studies show positive results, it's clear that how SDL is interpreted and implemented by both students and teachers makes a huge difference. That fear of students not covering all the necessary content can sometimes lead to teachers providing too much guidance, which can actually undermine the development of self-direction. So conceptual clarity, a shared understanding of SDL principles, and finding that sweet spot in terms of support are all crucial for PBL to succeed in cultivating self-directed learners.
So it's about striking that balance between structure and freedom, guidance and autonomy.
Exactly. And recognizing that the effectiveness of PBL in fostering SDL isn't automatic. It depends on a lot of factors.
All right, so for you, our listener, what are the key things to remember about all of this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that problem-based learning is deliberately structured to encourage self-directed learning skills. And while SDL has a lot in common with self-regulated learning, it gives learners more control right from the start, allowing them to shape their own learning journey. The research tells us that SDL tends to grow stronger over time as you experience PBL, but its success really hinges on both the learning environment and your own active participation in taking ownership of your learning. It's about being willing to step into that driver's seat, to embrace those moments of uncertainty, and to trust in your ability to navigate your own path toward knowledge and understanding.
And to build on that, I think it's crucial to remember that the journey towards self-directed learning in PBL is a gradual one. It's about unlocking that autonomy, step by step, as you gain experience, confidence, and trust in your ability to identify and pursue your own unique learning needs. It's not about instantly becoming a perfectly self-sufficient learner. It's about embracing that ongoing process of growth and development.
Well said. And this brings up a question that we'd like to leave you with. Given the importance of self-direction highlighted in both PBL and SDL, how might you apply these principles to your own learning, your own professional development, even outside of a formal educational setting?
What aspects of your learning do you currently control? And where could you potentially take more initiative, step more fully into that role of a self-directed learner? It's something to ponder as you continue on your own unique learning journey.
And we encourage you to delve deeper into these concepts of PBL and SDL to explore how different learning environments can either support or hinder your progress, and to consider how your own mindset and choices play a role in shaping your ability to become a truly self-directed learner.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.